Welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com. And if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, that is called Tar Heel Illustrated. I'm THI publisher Andrew Jones, and joining me is our Director of Basketball Recruiting and Analyst, longtime college AAU and high school coach, David Sisk. And David, we are here to continue our podcast preview series of North Carolina's 2022-23 basketball season. We have done the 5 starters. Now we're doing the returning reserves. We're going to focus on Puff Johnson, Dontre Styles, Justin McCoy, and DeMarco Dunn. I debated about including Will Shaver in here because he did join the program in the middle of the last season, but we're going to go ahead and keep him in the freshman class because he is a redshirt freshman and he did not appear in any games last year. So we'll do Shaver when we do the 4 freshmen. So David, the returning guys, they're an interesting group because whenever anybody talks about North Carolina's bench, the first question that comes out of their mouths is, well, will Hubert even play the guys? And I have to remind them that last year, Puff Johnson played 67 minutes in the NCAA tournament, and Anthony Harris was an 11-minute guy, 12-minute guy, and Dawson Garcia was a 21-minute guy before both of them either were ineligible in Harris's case or left the team in Garcia's place. So Hubert didn't play an iron 5 by design. He played an iron 5 because that's what ended up being the team. Styles wasn't ready, even though he played some in Fort Worth. McCoy struggled last year. Dunn wasn't ready at all. And even Puff's minutes up until March were really up until the game at NC State, the end of February, were very minimal. So your thoughts as an overview before we get into the individuals of these 4 returning reserves.
Well, and to piggyback off your thoughts there on how much will they play, and let me narrow that down to, I think it's more important maybe in the long run, what is Hubert's philosophy on playing players? And we're going to find out, I think, this year, because I think, as you said last year, there were so many close games that, and also there was a big dip. There's a reason it was an iron 5. We know there was a drop off when he went to the bench. So we don't know. I talked to a high school coach today, and who's got 10 or 11 guys that he could probably play that could make a viable, a viable argument for playing time, a lot of playing time. Probably 11 guys think they could start, and that's not good for a coach, because you can only start 5, so there's 6 groups of mamas and daddies not happy. But anyway, he was like, man, I can't stand not playing 7 or 8 at the most. I think my best 5 ought to be on the floor. I saw an interesting thing. Pete Carrill, died a couple of weeks ago, and I may have said this in another podcast, I don't remember. But Pete Carrill died, and they were talking about some of the things, his idiosyncrasies, and one of them was the starting lineup. He says, you play to win, so your best 5 players usually are your starters. He said, so why would I take my best player out and play my 8th best player for 10 minutes that he could be in? He said, so there, his thing was he was going to play 5 no matter what. And there's some other coaches that are comfortable playing a large group. We don't know where Coach Davis stands in this yet. Now, to get to your big point, like you said, I do think, with some of the younger players, Dontre Styles having a year under his belt, I think Puff Johnson coming off injury. You look at DeMarco Dunn having a year under his belt, and some others. It's going to be interesting to see the time that they get. And then you've got freshmen coming in the mix. So, but one other thing here, not only do we think the bench will probably be a little bit better than it was last year, or hopefully more than a little bit, and we mentioned this one in another one. We talked about like Armando Bacot and Caleb Love and some of those playing a lot of minutes. You kind of hope this North Carolina team this year, if they play up to expectations, they're going to have a lot of lopsided scores. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity to play these guys and to rest your starters some and to play them and let them grow. And like I said, they're just – North Carolina, man, was fighting for their life last year getting the NCAA tournament. So there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. That window was very narrow. But this year, you think it's going to be a lot wider, and there's going to be a lot more opportunity for more players.
And they didn't blow out the quote unquote patsies last year, not in the manner that you would expect for a team that ended up playing in the national title game. They struggled to beat Brown. They had to make buckets in the last couple of minutes to beat Brown at home. They didn't blow out Furman. They didn't totally blow out Appalachian State. So they never had that huge comfort.
Boston College was the least talented ACC team I've ever seen. And you remember what happened in Chapel Hill. I mean, it was
but even the Patsies, they just never. Yeah. Dontrez Styles played 22 minutes before the calendar year changed.
Yeah,
and he played 40 in Fort Worth. So they didn't have those huge leads, and Hubert was trying to get these guys. He was trying to figure out what worked. And I think the Garcia Manic thing was sort of an issue. And we're not talking Manic, obviously, but it's no coincidence that I think Manic played his best basketball after Garcia left because he kind of knew exactly where his slot was. That's his part of the puzzle. He fits in there nicely. Now be your part of the puzzle the rest of the way. And he was. The other guys kind of struggled to really find their way. And a lot of it is because they didn't get those early minutes because they weren't blowing people out. They weren't clobbering people to the point where Hubert's like, you know what? I could play Dontrez 4 minutes in the first half because we're already up 17 and this thing is trending to 35. They didn't have that many of those opportunities. Some of the minutes those guys got early on were when they were blown out against Kentucky, against Wake Forest, against Miami. Those were 3 horrible performances in a month's time. And that's where Styles got most of his minutes until they got to the NCAA tournament. He had a couple, I think against Florida State, they had a big win, and against NC State at home, he played some minutes and stuff, but that was pretty much it. So since I'm talking about Styles right there, let's go to Dontrez Styles. He played 175 minutes last year in 30 games. So it's around 5 a game or something like that. 6'6", real athletic kid. He's 6'6", but I think he could play longer because he's got long arms. He always, to me, he appears bigger than his weight and longer than his height. And I also think part of that's because he's a really interesting weak side player. Hubert has said multiple times, Dontrez can be an outstanding weak side rebounder, nose to the ball. He's very springy. So a guy with long arms who's 6'6" and is springy is going to play taller than 6'6" some of the time. I think that's what they're looking for from Dontrez. A couple of other stats real quickly, 2 points a game, 24 from 55 from the floor, which is 43.6%. Struggled from 3 for 18. He did hit that one against Baylor right in front of me in the second round of the NCAA tournament. He actually played 25 minutes in that game. And let me throw these numbers into you, David, then I'll dump it to you. In the 40 minutes in Fort Worth, he scored 15 points, 9 rebounds, and assists, and 2 steals. And he was on the court for the last, 15, 16 minutes of the Baylor game, one that they somehow found a way to win in overtime and advance. So what are your thoughts about Dontrez?
I want to turn this over to you for a minute and ask you a question because I want your opinion on this. Because here I'm going to give my thought in a question. So when I look at him, and so our thing has been, or my thing rather, does he and Dontrez and Puff Johnson, are they fighting for the same minutes? So my question to you, in seeing them and being there the other night and being around the team, press conferences, practices, things like that, you've seen a lot more of it than I have. Do you think, with your description, 6'6", long-armed, are they looking on down the road that he's more of a leaky at the 3, or do you see him at the 4 to play for those minutes? Because it looks like Puff Johnson's more of a 4.
I think that's interesting. No one's ever asked the leaky thing with him. They usually think sort of him as a small
6'6", long arm. That's the first thing.
Yeah. Well, and supremely athletic. He's strong. He's stronger now than Leaky was at that stage. I would say he's probably a little bit more athletic, a little bouncier than Leaky. Leaky's got a little more length. Leaky's a really smart dude and a smart player. I don't know Dontrez well enough to know where he is in that sense. But I think that's a role he could fit. I think Dontrez has more offensive skills, at least shooting. He's got a prettier shot than Leaky has had. We haven't seen enough, to be honest with you. There's a little bit of a different edge that he plays with. If you put him into the Leaky role, he wouldn't be Leaky. He would be Dontrez handling that role. So you might get a couple more things than you get with Leaky in one area, but then you give up a few things in another area from Leaky. Puff, I don't think fully fits in that role 100%, just because we haven't seen him defend enough, in my opinion. I'd like to see Puff defend more. Now, he's a good defensive player, but when Leaky decided to come back, a lot of people immediately thought, well, there's Puff's minutes. So, well, that's maybe not so, because Puff could do a lot of things, and Puff is a lot more comfortable in the baseline. I think a lot of people realize, and a 4 is going to play the baseline a lot. Manek had a really good baseline game that he showed more and more of last year. So I don't know if they're fighting for the same minutes. I think that they could coexist at the same time. But there might be a point down the road in an NCAA tournament where Hubert's going to say, you know what, we need what Puff gives us more in this game. That will help us with matchups. Or there might be another opponent where he says Dontrez and what he brings to the floor helps us a little bit more. So I could see one getting 15 minutes in a Sweet 16 game against one team. And if it's somebody else, the other gets 15 minutes and the other dude gets maybe 7. So I think that's the way it's going to break down. Ultimately, they're good to have because they're different guys, and he can use those matchup equivalencies throughout the course of the year as well.
It's intriguing to me with these young guys, and I think I'm looking at the big picture. I know we're doing this one on Dontrez, but I look at kind of the big picture here. So you've got him. Let's say he's the 3. Let's say Puff's the 4. Then you bring in Jalen Washington at the 4, freshman. You bring in Tyler Nickel, who might play at the 3, and then you're bringing in Zayden High next year when, you're talking about these guys being a year more into the program. You've got a lot of guys jockeying right there for the same spot. So it's going to be very interesting to me, which one of these guys, especially the old one, not necessarily the freshmen, on guys like Puff Johnson, on guys like Dontrez here, how they mesh this year, what their season's like. Do they get minutes? And then some of these younger guys behind them pushing them, because, it's almost, you feel almost like not only are you playing, if you're Dontrez, for right now to get your time, you're also playing for the future because you got younger guys pushing you. So, you could look at this for a couple of these guys like a make or break year. So, we know what Dontrez with that athleticism and things that he does. So I think it's an opportunity when they get in for guys to put their best foot forward, play to their strengths. Like you said, athletic, bouncy. I guess I'm kind of looking at him in that role, maybe like a Leaky on the defensive end, that he can just really be able to defend with all that and wreak some havoc. And he looked to me like a guy who, once you get out the open floor, and we know North Carolina wants to run, could really do some damage out there. So, when he gets that opportunity, he needs to play to his strengths, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and he's going to have some of his opportunities. He hasn't had a chance yet in college to play X number of minutes in that range every game for a sustainable period of time, just to see how his game grows while he's actually getting in-game minutes. So hopefully for his sake, they're in a situation where he can get those minutes, where Hubert and the staff can get some more intel really on what kind of player he is. Because as a longtime coach, David, guys are different in games than they are in practice. I know that Hubert says he bases everything on how they play in practice. I get that. But sometimes guys are a little bit different in games than they are in practice. And sometimes they need to be in games to help them become better practice players, because they need to have stuff on film. They need to know that this part of their footwork really isn't working right. They need to adjust it. Or this element of their help side defense and their communication was poor and they were exposed in a game. And sometimes they need that. So students need tests and players need games. So I think that'll be really good for Dontrez. Puff has played. Last year, there was a lot of talk about maybe just having him sit it out. He can use it as a red shirt because he has a COVID year as well, just get fully healthy. But then when they brought him in, I guess early January, it was around the time I think they knew that Harris wasn't going to be able to play. And there was already some issues with Garcia, and then eventually they needed Puff. They weren't going to be able to have the luxury of holding off and letting him continue to heal. And he played well when he got in there for a while and earned a spot as what eventually became the sixth man. He played 249 minutes in 24 games, so he averaged 10 minutes a game, 3.1 points, 2 rebounds. He shot 45.9% from the floor, 6 for 26 from three. He has not shot it well from three in college yet, but again, he hasn't had a lot of sustained time. But to me, what stands out and what I'm really going to hold on to with respect to Puff is 67 minutes in the NCAA tournament. In the title game, 18 minutes, 11.6 rebounds. And then late in February, he had a game in NC State where he played 29 minutes. He scored 16 points, had 5 rebounds. Leaky got hurt in the first half of that game, so Puff kind of carried the weight in that spot. I like Puff's game because I think Puff is a guy that can play in a lot of situations. He's a cerebral player. He looks to pass. He's not a guy who's going to force a lot of things. There's a smoothness to his game, but there's a little awkwardness to it as well, which I think can actually work into his advantage because, as you know, David, those elbows and kneecap guys are really hard to guard sometimes. And I think Puff has a lot of that, but his problem is staying healthy. He missed the exhibition game because he's had a strained knee. He had missed 10 days of practice leading up to the exhibition game. Hubert said he expects him to be healthy for the opener November 7th, but we don't know. He's had a lot of different parts of his body that have given him problems since he arrived in school. So they need Styles to be a pretty good and consistent and confident player this year, because I don't know how much you can pencil in anything for Puff given his injury history.
Yeah, and one thing I want to go back to, and I was thinking about also, maybe with how Styles, with his identity, maybe has changed. You know, I heard somebody say when Hubert stayed with him after Roy retired, and Hubert stayed with him, and they said, you know, that at that time that Hubert Davis really, that Styles could be that player that really kind of brings North Carolina offensively with a lineup into a different age, because, you know, to talk about Roy Williams, he always liked a traditional 4. And they said, well, Hubert's going to bring him in and he's going to go small ball 4. And we had heard, and these came from a very good source who knows the game. And he said, you know, that's what he kind of took from it. And now that Manick has that outstanding year, and you go back to Pete Nance, who's 6'10", 6'11", it looks like Hubert wants to go with a bigger 4 who can step out and stretch, you know. And so you've got guys both in that 6'10" range that are really good outside shooters. So maybe that does go back with him, you know, thinking about it now, to that 3 spot, and that Hubert's kind of got that lineup that he likes. But like I said, a lot of guys fighting for minutes. And here's the thing. You talked about like counting on Puff, and that's what Hubert Davis has got to find out, you know, and that's what every coach is trying to find out now. Who can I count on?
Yeah.
And you know, you were talking about, you know, the other night against Johnson C. Smith, you've got, I think, 4 players that didn't play, that didn't dress out. So it's giving guys more reps, more opportunities. You got another one coming up, and, you know, and then when you open up with UNC Wilmington, and you've got some of these games here, we would expect, like I said, North Carolina to distance themselves. You never can tell early in the year, but we would expect them to distance themselves on the scoreboard. And I would think that Hubert Davis goes to that bench a little bit more in some of these games early on. And, you know, we'll get excited about whoever turns it on. So if Dontrez turns it on, you know, then, you know, we're going to be singing his praises. There's no doubt about that. But I'll tell you this, the one advantage I give him, Dontrez Styles, early on, is when you're playing the UNC Wilmingtons and some of these other teams early on, the mid-major, low-major type teams, he's going to be more athletic than anybody they've got on the floor. So even coming off the bench, he's got an advantage over the guys that they're playing against, especially when North Carolina want to get out and run. So you think these early games would be good confidence boosters for him to really kind of play in his wheelhouse a little bit.
And a confident player is going to let his game flow.
Yes.
More of his game's going to come out. So you're really going to see, what's there. They've seen everything in practice. They've seen everything and all that kind of stuff. But I'm talking about the mind on the floor. A lot of guys get on the floor and they inhibit themselves too much. There's confidence issues. If there's a starter on the floor, or a bunch of starters on the floor, they don't want to be the man when those guys are out there because they feel like they have to defer. But some dudes will come in off the bench and like, hey, I'm worthy of being here. I'm going to play my game. And if I get shots with these guys out there, I get shots. So a lot of those things you can't find out as much in practice as you can in actual real games with fans in the stands. So they get a chance to learn that.
Let me ask you this. So when Dontrez is out there on the floor, you're there courtside, you're there watching the game in person. I'm usually watching it on TV. Do you ever catch yourself saying, man, he looks like a basketball player?
Yeah.
Because he does to me. When I'm watching on there, you get the and I never liked scouting a player on film, on like a recruit. I love to see it in person because you just can't tell you can't tell exactly the motor, how quick. You'll see some guy in person, you could maybe see him on TV 100 times. You see him in person that first time, you go, man, I didn't know he was that big. I didn't know he was that real. Man, I didn't know his first step was that. I didn't know he was that athletic. But you look at him and it kind of leaps off the page, even though he's still trying to get it together as a freshman. And you're going, man, if he doesn't make it, he's going to miss a great chance. Because you watch him run, you look at his body and all that, and man, he looks like a basketball player.
I'll tell you what, when they go to Bloomington, they played Indiana in late November. Yeah, late November. When they go there for that game, there'll be some Indiana fans that don't really know North Carolina that well. They won't really know. If they don't know the team very well, they may know Baycott, may know Love a little bit, maybe not at all. When Carolina comes out and starts shooting around and doing their thing, they're all going to look at Dontrez and think, oh, that guy starts. That guy's going to play. That guy's got to be a problem tonight because he looks the part. And that's the thing about him. That's why I think he's so intriguing. And some guys look the part and they're not. I think Dontrez could eventually be that guy. And I also think Puff can as well. Puff looks different. He carries himself a little differently. He's got different body mannerisms, stuff like that. But I like his feel for the game. Maybe part of this is because I covered Cam for 2 years and saw him turn himself into a fantastic player. And people I talk to that know the Johnsons and really close to the situation swear that Puff was always ahead of where Cam was at those stages. But the difference is after Cam's freshman year at Pitt, he stayed healthy. Well, he was injured a little bit at Carolina, beginning of his first year at Carolina. But after that, he was all right, other than ding up stuff. But Puff just has got to get on the floor and he's got to stay on the floor. And if he could play the entire season, I do think ultimately he would be the sixth man because I think Hubert does trust him when he's healthy. And I think he likes some of the unique things that he brings to the floor. And he is a cerebral IQ guy out there who's got length, who's got good hands, who has that knack of finding the right guy or getting the shot off. You think about what he did in the national title game, aside from throwing up, He did some really big things in that game. His tip in at the end of the half was just knocked for the game, letting everything flow. Oh, yeah, there's 75,000 people in here. No big deal. And it's funny because he joked. He told a story that one of the officials went up to him and patted him on the behind during going into a timeout and said, hey, Puff, look around. There's 76,000 people in here or something like that. And he was like, oh, wow. He said up to that point, he hadn't even thought about it. He was so lost in the game. Yeah, but he was so lost in the game, which I like about him. I think there's a competitive juice there to him, which is very real. And if he's healthy this year and plays a lot, I think we're going to see a lot of that come out.
I go back to Baylor too, after Manick's out, and he made some huge plays and everybody had to contribute to that game. But, like we talked about going back, Manick is out. They're way behind when Manick has to leave, and he's out, much of the second half. And Caleb Love scored 5 points that game.
Yeah.
And, and they beat a 1 seed, and they had to score in the 90s. And he had some huge plays in that game. So, and I'm a believer in this. a lot, but he might not get as much attention because he's still coming off the bench. But a lot of times, players will have big tournaments, or they'll really younger guys will make those improvements at the end of the year, and it's just noticeable. And then guys leave, they're starting that next year, and the talk will be, well, look out for this player. He had a huge tournament. He finished the year on the upswing. He's got a ton of potential. This is the kind of the breakout guy, the guy to look for. And, Puff had that kind of tournament in some games, but because he's not starting, and like you say, there's always, it seems like there's been injury issues. I shouldn't say always, but there have been injuries issues. Maybe we tapped the brakes just a little bit. But, he is a candidate that we would normally say, hey, look out, this could be a breakout guy, just based on his ability and based on how he finished the year.
I think if Leakey moved on, Puff would be starting in that spot.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and he wouldn't, he's not the defensive player Leakey is, but he's more of an offensive player. So,
and if he was starting, I think the narrative about him would be totally different.
I agree with you about that. I agree.
If he did, I think the points that I made about him finishing strong last year and having a really good tournament, I think that would really be getting a lot of press.
Justin McCoy also did not play in the exhibition game. He had a non-COVID related illness. Justin is a guy that I will tell everybody who's listening and watching right now, if you go to a game that Carolina plays early enough and you watch him do things in warmups, he's got beautiful skills. The thing that he lacks is he doesn't have that spring step, and he's not super quick, but he's very highly skilled guy. I think he's a much better player than what he showed last year. Played 209 minutes in 30 games, had some DNPs down, late in the year, 8 for 36 from the floor, which is 22%. He's much better than that. 3 for 12 from 3-point range. I think Justin's a much better player, but when I look at this roster, I don't know where a lot of his minutes are going to come from. I think we're going to see some more DNPs there. And I'll tell you, if you have a guy who started 11 games at Virginia a couple of years ago when they won the regular season ACC title, if you have a guy like that well into your rotation, if he's not even maybe on the just outside of that rotation, especially against better teams, that tells you that this club's got a lot of dudes, because Justin, I think, can do some reliable things. He's a pretty good defensive player, and he's pretty solid around the basket. Tony Bennett, when he was at Virginia, he said, look, when I need a guy to go in there and muck it up, and I need a guy there go in there and do sound things, I put Justin McCoy in. And whenever Jay Huff got in foul trouble, McCoy was the guy that went in there. Jay Huff's in the NBA. So there was a lot of trust there. And I think maybe there were times last year where he didn't appear to have a ton of confidence. If he's confident, David, and he is inserted into games this year, I do think he can help this team.
Yeah, because of the experience. Like you say, you always like that guy that'll do the dirty work. And he kind of fits that bill a little bit. But here's the thing. You've already got a starter like that in Leakey. And so one guy that'll do that's good. But if you have two guys out there who are not big time offensive threats, and I'm not casting aspersion at anybody, but guys are what they are. So you can kind of get away with one guy maybe that's not the necessarily scorer, but it's hard to have two out there. So I think, and you've got to look, you had an Iron 5 last year, so you had certain guys that weren't coming out. And so, when you went to that bench, you wanted somebody like a Puff who could get you some points, who could get on a little bit of a roll. So I think it depends on lineups a little bit, but if you've already said it, if you've got a deep bench, if you got some dudes, I didn't even mention him in the mix a while ago. We're fighting for the spots at that 3 and 4. Yeah. If you got guys who can put it in the bucket and do those little things, man, it makes it tough on guys who may not be scoring threats, because I think, we've talked about, we're not sure about Dontrez yet. We'll see. We know Puff can score a little bit. I think he's a better shooter than what those numbers that you indicated, because, you know, he came to North Carolina with a 3-point shooting reputation. Now, if you don't have confidence in your game and you've not found that flow yet, I think it impacts your shooting. So as he gets more comfortable, I think you'll see that shot percentage go up. And you go with Washington. You know, Hubert's already said, you know, that he may be one of the best shooters he's been around that's been in that program, and which is a mouthful to me. I'll have to see it, but if that's true, that is a mouthful. We know Tyler Nickel, all-time, you know, the leading scorer in the state of Virginia. So there are guys fighting for those spots who can score. So what his MO has got to be is that he can be the guy you count on the defensive rotations that'll defend, that'll rebound, that'll do that thing, that'll play so hard. Like Shane Battier used to say, I'm going to play so hard that I don't give the coach a reason for not having me in the lineup. Yeah. So you got to kind of be that kind of guy and hope some of these other guys, younger guys, haven't figured that part of the game out yet.
You know, if you have that period in the season where Armando misses a game because of an ankle and Nance gets in foul trouble, you know, we'll talk about Shaver when we talk about the freshman. Having a guy like McCoy who has played the 5, he's played a lot, he can defend and box out and do things. That's tremendous insurance to have. And you never know when you have a game where you need to stick a guy like that in there for 4 or 5 minutes, and he can help you win a game. And in March, he can help you advance. And so having a kid like him in the program and position where he is a positive thing, because there aren't many clubs in the country that have a guy in that 10 through 13 range in the rotation, or 9 through 13, who started 11 games on an ACC regular season champion, or however many games it was at UVA that year.
You know, there's certain guys like that in the country that you may not see. You may see every 3 or 4 games, but the coach can trust them, and the player kind of has an understanding that there's some limitations there, and they're fine with that rotation or playing time. Lance Ware at Kentucky's a guy like that, because Calipari can totally trust him defensively. He's not going to have any breakdowns. He's not going to get lost on defense. And there's a trust issue there with a coach. And it may be, hey, like I said, he may not go a couple of games or may not play, and then they're in. The coach says, you know, he's not going to pout. He's not going to sulk. He's going to work, even if he's not playing. He's going to stay ready. He's going to watch tape. He's going to know the scouting report. And then, so if you're Hubert Davis, and let's say he doesn't get many minutes for 2 weeks or so, and then all of a sudden, you know, you're playing at Notre Dame, and you need him, you know, in a tight game like last year, you can put him in and he can give you some of that. And like I said, he may not, you know, who knows? He may get some points, but you know, at least on, he's not going to make mistakes. There's not going to be breakdowns. And he's a guy that Hubert Davis will be able to trust to do the right things.
He hit 2 free throws in overtime against Baylor that were big. DeMarco Dunn played 94 minutes in 23 games last year, averaged 1 point. But he started the exhibition game. Hubert was asked, why did he start? And keep in mind, RJ Davis did not dress for the exhibition game. And Hubert said he earned it in practice. Now, I haven't really, the very little intel that I've been able to come up with outside of direct stuff that I get when I'm there, stuff that's public, haven't really heard much about DeMarco, to be honest with you. They're not getting, I'm hearing about other guys. And when some of the players have been asked, okay, who's showing out in practice and that kind of thing, DeMarco's name's not really coming up. However, he looked really comfortable in the exhibition game after the first few minutes. I would say after 3 or 4 minutes, he looked a little uncomfortable at first because he's out there with Caleb and Armando and Leakey and Pete Nance. And then I think he started feeling, you know, playing like he looked like he felt like he belonged. and he ended up scoring 9 points or something like that. I can't remember the exact point total, but he had some nice buckets. He's a guard who has that little mid-range game where he can use the dribble, get inside, and always finds that little spot maybe to get a 15-footer off. I think there's some of that in his game that I didn't really know before was in his game. He has a reputation of being a perimeter shooter. He's pretty athletic. He's got some bounce. He looked pretty solid defensively the other night. So when I look at him, I say, okay, here's a guy who knew what his role was a year ago. He was just learning his way. People were thinking during the season, well, DeMarco will leave. He'll go back to Arizona because he's from that area originally. But he stayed, and he worked his tail off in the offseason. And he's in a situation now where there is going to be an opportunity for somebody to get minutes there. I know everyone thinks that Trimble's going to get a lot of the minutes, and he will play, but there's going to be opportunities for other minutes and other situations. And as you and I were just talking about with McCoy or with Styles or something like that, you're going to get these guys get an opportunity to play some early. Maybe they earn the trust that in mid-January, there's a game where a guy's out and there's a foul trouble and someone else gets banged up and you need to dig really deep in the bench. And because DeMarco got some minutes early and played pretty well early and gained some confidence and got trust from Hubert, he's inserted in the lineup and all of a sudden he's got a 15-minute game. I do think that that's possible. I need to see more of his game to get a better feel, to be honest with you, David. But there is something to say about getting Hubert's trust to start in the exhibition game. Perhaps he didn't want to start a freshman over him, and he wanted to go with the older guy. He was next in line. Maybe that was part of it because that's sort of the Roy Williams way of doing things, the Dean Smith way of doing things, especially with an exhibition game. Or maybe he really has played very well, and teammates just haven't mentioned his name because they just haven't mentioned his name.
He's got an advantage. And I'm talking about DeMarco Dunn. And here it is. You don't have the gridlock in the backcourt in numbers that you have at the 3 and 4. We just kept mentioning names that can play in that 3 and 4 spot. So if you look at that backcourt, we know who our 2 starters are going to be. So you've got Seth Trimble, and you could really play DeMarco at that other shooting guard. And so if you're talking about 2 deep at every spot, there's a spot for him. And if you talk about players 1 through 13, and you just did a number from top to bottom, a hierarchy, with Armando Bacot being number 1 and whoever at the bottom, there may be guys that you mention, more front court guys that you might put at number 7 or number 8, and you might put DeMarco down under a little bit. But DeMarco might end up playing more than them simply because the way the roster kind of shakes out where it's top heavy toward the front court. So, like I said, there's a 2 deep spot for him, I think, at that shooting guard, in my opinion, behind Caleb, and then Seth Trimble can play the combo a little bit, but Seth Trimble behind RJ. So you kind of look at that. So if he can go out, I think he'll have the opportunity to prove himself. I don't think there's like I said, there's not as much gridlock right there. You brought something up about confidence. At the 1st of August, the PGA, the FedEx playoffs, PGA was in Memphis, and I went to it, and there's a local guy that I went down to watch. His name's Lee Hodges. He was a rookie on the PGA Tour, and he played his way into the FedEx Cup, into the top 70 or top 125, almost made the top 70, but had a great rookie season, was one of the best rookies on the PGA Tour, and basically kind of earned his card to come back for another year and play in some bigger events. He 2 weeks ago, when they had the big tournament, CJ Cup down in South Carolina, he was at the end of the 2nd round, maybe a shot or 2 out of the lead. He was in 6th place, and they interviewed him. And I heard him say, they said, "You had a great rookie year, or a good rookie year. What was the biggest thing you took from it?" And he said, "That I belonged." He said, I never believed I belonged the whole time I was out there. And I didn't believe I belonged while I was playing. And it's hard, even when you're in the mix, it's hard to play well when you don't have that confidence. He said, I had to get away from it and sit back after the season was over and go back home and sit down for a little bit and look at things. And he said, hey, you think this guy is a player, you won more money than he did. You finished higher up in the standings than he did. And I think so if you're DeMarco, you said he looked like he thought he belonged. And so maybe now as a sophomore, he believes that. Yeah. Maybe he didn't believe it as a freshman. I don't know. But that's half the battle right there. So if he plays like that, we know he had a big time score reputation coming out of high school. So if he can show some of that, I mean, it's not a given that these guys coming in, North Carolina's recruiting big time guards, that DeMarco Dunn just goes to the wayside. Now, they're going to keep recruiting big time guards, but it's like an AAU coach told me. He had a player, and I'm not going to mention where he's at, but he's got a player that's at a big time program. And I remember his coach telling me, he said, no, if you go to a North Carolina, a Duke, a Kansas, or a Kentucky, you go to those four, you're going to get recruited over constantly. He said, now the first time you get recruited over, don't pack your bags and come home. He says, you're not coming home. You're sticking it out. And you've got to earn your playing time. And when you think you've got it, they're going to keep recruiting these guys. So that is the advice I would give to DeMarco Dunn. Go after it, play like you belong, play your best ball. And if you do that, there's a spot. Yes, North Carolina's going to keep recruiting guards. Once RJ and Caleb Love are gone, they're going to have the Wilchers come in. They're after Cadu. They're after Ian Jackson. They're after Boogie Fland. They're after these guys that could come in. But, you just keep playing and playing and playing and play well. There's a spot somewhere, Seth Trimble. There's a spot there for you if you prove yourself.
I'll close this podcast with this, and this applies more to Dontrez and DeMarco than anybody else, but I think it might apply even to Justin some too, given the way last season went. There is a difference between game confidence and practice confidence.
Yeah.
You know that.
Yep.
And game confidence is irreplaceable. It is one of the most important things a kid can accumulate when he's in college, and it makes him a different player. It will always take his game up a notch or two, no matter who they are. Game confidence is unbelievable. So at some point in time this year, if you and I are doing a podcast, we might do a podcast solely about game confidence. We might do something on the non-starters. Who's got game confidence? I think Puff has game confidence. That's not going to go away. Who else has game confidence? There are a lot of guys on that roster that are really talented, but they need to acquire game confidence. And if they have the opportunities early, because they do stretch leads out like they didn't do a year ago, a lot of these guys are going to have an opportunity to gain game confidence. And maybe that's a podcast we'll hit on around New Year's, when they go full-fledged into the rest of the ACC schedule. It'll be interesting to see how those first 2 months play out and where some of these guys are with respect to game confidence at that point.
I remember several years ago, there was a great article on ESPN.com about Al Golden when he was coaching at Temple. And Temple evidently was unlike the football program, was like any other football program in America. And they were telling these stories about when he coached there, how the football field was next to a high-rise, and they had to walk by the high-rise. It was a housing project to get to the practice field out there, and people were dumping urine on them and hollering, "You suck," and y'all never won, and all this stuff, and it was great. But he said he had a player, was like you were talking about, that was his best practice player. Man, it was just to the wall every practice. And he said he practiced so well that he decided he was going to start him. He said he was his most reliable player. So he brings him in on Wednesday, and he says, all right, you have earned a starting spot. We play Miami Saturday. You're starting. Well, the guy quit the next day, cleaned his locker out, and left because he was going to be playing. He didn't want to play. He just wanted to practice. He liked to practice. He didn't want to play against Miami. That was a whole different ballgame. So he quit. He got named starting. So, like you say, there's a difference. I don't think if they get named starter is going to quit. But if you start, like you say, to get into that, not the starting role, but get into that playing time role, the opportunities are going to be there for guys. So that's what I want to see. Those guys are putting it out there in practice. So when it gets into the games, because there's only so many minutes and so many spots, there are going to be some guys make it. And just the law of averages, there's going to be some guys that don't and go on down the line and they don't get the time, and we'll see who makes it and who doesn't. But, some will, some won't. So it's going to be interesting because there are a lot of guys right now I think are kind of an even footing. And that race right there to me to see who kind of separates themselves in the pack from the pack, it's going to be intriguing.
If you know any Carolina fans who do not know that we exist, let them know. Send them this video. Send them a link to our site, tarheelillustrated.com. Let them know for just $8.33 a month. They can be Tar Heel insiders too. Remember to like the video, share it, and all that good stuff that Jacob says at the end of the podcast when he's hosting. He's David Sisk. I'm Andrew Jones. We appreciate you stopping by.